Good evening and welcome to the 23rd episode of Leadership Conversations in the Development Sector. The social impact sector is full of passionate leaders with innovative outlooks on the world's greatest problems. Our leadership conversations focus on the unique insights offered by these leaders as they share their experiences and move the development sector forward. Our host, GoBarefoot, is an interactive web portal dedicated to the social sector. It brings together individuals, NGOs, NPOs, and the CSR arms of organizations with the mandate of creating a one-stop information website for both networking and knowledge sharing. We're supported by Catalyze, an NGO which has been preparing young women for leadership roles to create equality in opportunities and bridge the gender gap. Also, we are supported by third sector partners, India's only executive search firm exclusively for the development sector. Our guest today is one of the leading lights in the development sector. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Dr. Mukund Rajan, Chairman, ECube Investment Advisors. ECube Investment Advisors is a first of its kind platform created in 2019 to catalyze environment, social, and governance changes in corporate India. Dr. Rajan also serves as the chairperson of the Environment Committee of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry and is a member of the ECG Advisory Committee constituted by the Securities and Exchange Board of India. He also serves as a member of the Council of Management of the Forum of Free Enterprise. In 2007, the World Economic Forum honored Dr. Rajan as a young global leader. He was also a part of the inaugural class of the Confederation of Indian Industry. Dr. Rajan graduated from the BTech program at the IIT Delhi in 1989. He completed a master's and doctorate in international relations on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford University. His doctoral dissertation, Global Environmental Politics, was published by Oxford University Press in 1996, and his second book, The Brand Custodian, My Years with the Tatas, was published by HarperCollins in 2019. His third book on corporate responsibility and ECG, titled Outlast, How ECG Can Benefit Your Business, co-authored with Dr. Colonel Rajiv Kumar, has recently been published by HarperCollins. In conversation with Dr. Rajan is Shital Kakkar Mehra, leadership expert and executive presence coach for CEOs. Shital has trained over 75,000 professionals across Asia and has personally coached over 1,000 CXOs in the past 2 decades. She has conducted workshops for diverse organizations across Asia and has been invited as a speaker by leading B-schools and professional associations. She's a best-selling author, and her latest best-selling book, Executive Presence, The Poise Formula for Leadership, is India's first research-based formula on this leadership skill. Sheetal is an active philanthropist and social entrepreneur. Thank you, Dr. Rajan and Sheetal, for joining us today. Over to you, Sheetal.
Thank you. Welcome, Mukund, to this session. And it's an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you here. And we are really excited to hear your views.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm going to start with my first question. You started your corporate career, and after 23 years of working with one of the largest corporations, you started your entrepreneurial journey to catalyze the ESG transition of Indian businesses. So what drove this decision?
In life, you sometimes have the good fortune of being able to connect the dots in terms of what has taken place in your career and why certain actions followed. So in my case, just to try and connect the dots that led to what I'm doing now, my master's and doctorate at Oxford were in the field of environmental politics. And I had a very early view of the politics of global environmental issues. In fact, my first book is titled Global Environmental Politics, India and the North-South Politics of Global Environmental Issues. And that sort of set up a pretty much lifelong interest in what's happening with issues like ozone depletion, tropical deforestation, global warming, and the like. Years later at the Tatas, I took on the mantle of Chief Sustainability Officer, Chief Ethics Officer, and the Brand Custodian. And so much of the Tata brand is actually built on the group's sense of responsibility for the environment, responsibility for giving back to society. So I had a way to actually understand the kind of impact the corporate sector has on many of these issues and the way these issues are impacting corporate strategy. And so in 2018, I thought time had come for me to, in a sense, connect all the dots, combine my interest with my passion, try and see if I could give back a lot of what I'd learned while working with the Tatas. And that therefore led to the creation of the firm that I chair today called ECube. And as the name suggests, it's drawn from three E's. It stands for engage and empower for ESG. So that's how I've ended up playing some role in the sustainability and ESG space.
Very interesting journey. I've read your second book and I've really enjoyed your third book. So please tell our audience about your latest book, Outlast, on this very interesting subject.
Sure. So the subtitle to Outlast is actually how ESG can benefit your business. And really, given the current interest I have in this space, I felt it would be useful to package all of my own learning and talk about what it takes to succeed in business. And the point that my co-author Rajiv and I make in the book is really around that word outlast. What does it take to survive into the long term? And for a business to be able to deliver sustainable, profitable growth into the long term, you have to take ESG very seriously. You have to embrace an ESG agenda. You have to ensure ESG gets mainstreamed into your business strategy. We also make the point that really corporate responsibility has come a long way from the old sense of really being focused only on shareholder privacy to a new standard, a modern standard that looks at value creation for all stakeholders. And so if you want to have a successful business, you have to take this agenda and deliver value for all stakeholders, not just your shareholders, but indeed for your customers, your employees, your responsibility to the environment, and so on and so forth. I also make the point in the book that this phase that Indian business is now going through, coming on the back of a lot of what you've seen in recent years, collapses in corporate governance in many corporations, big and small, the whole COVID experience, before that, the global financial crisis. All of this points to one very important element, and we actually suggest that this is very similar to the kind of experience corporate India went through in the 1991 period and post the economic reforms of 1991 for the next few years, when many of the largest corporations and a whole bunch of mid-market and small and medium enterprises essentially vanished because they couldn't cope with the changes that were coming at them thick and fast, the opening up of the economy, new competition from multinational corporations, new technology imported from the West, and so on. Likewise, the ESG challenges we suggest in the book are going to be of similar magnitude and gravity. And companies that don't keep pace, that don't understand the new responsibilities expected from corporates and their leadership are going to pay a very heavy price. It's no different from the kind of challenge that Indian companies faced in 1991.
Very interesting. In fact, you have shared some very interesting ESG-friendly actions of a few Indian companies in your book. So could you just share with our listeners a couple of examples which you've given in the book? And of course, I'm sure they'll be very excited after that to read some more in the book.
Well, maybe they should look at the book to figure out what sort of best companies are doing in India. But of course, I've given a lot of examples of the Tata Group because I was intimately involved with many of these. For instance, the corporate volunteering program at companies like Tata is, I think, something that's a breath of fresh air, where employees in the corporate sector are now being given the opportunity to engage very closely with the development sector. In Tata's, of course, there's a reason for that. We wanted to align that activity very strongly with our employees' understanding of what the brand stood for. And the fact that ultimately at the ownership level, Tatas are held principally by charities. And a lot of the employee pride that goes into working for the Tatas is the sense that the harder you work, the more surpluses you generate, the more you can do for social causes. And that's a very different sort of orientation from what I dare say many other corporations experience with their employees. But there are many examples of companies that are doing well on each of the themes of E, S, or G. Equally, there are many challenges that lie ahead, which we also talk about in the book.
Interesting. Now, the subject matter of ESG is very vast. Since we have limited time, would you like to highlight some of the major ESG related issues that India is currently facing?
So I just mentioned challenges, right, that we talk about in the book. And honestly, you could argue, this is the cup half full or the cup half empty. You could argue, looking at a cup half empty, that there is an ESG crisis in this country. A few minutes back, I talked about the challenges of corporate governance, for instance. You're seeing companies high in the mighty and companies much smaller, including many of the startups recently that have faced significant corporate governance challenges. A large part of the explanation for the high non-performing assets in the Indian banking system, which in turn is a reason for India's economic slowdown, is because of poor corporate governance. Similarly, in the environmental space, the fact that the majority of the world's 30 most polluted cities in terms of air pollution are found in this one country, India, or the fact that so many of our water bodies are polluted, all speak to the fact that there is an environmental crisis also. And if you turn to the social agenda, I think two issues that we talk about a lot in the book. One is gender diversity and the role of women in the workplace. India has one of the poorest ratios in terms of female labor force participation in the world. If you could double the number of women just to get a little closer, we'd still be less than, but still get a little closer to the global average, you could do miracles for our GDP. Our ambitions of becoming a $5 trillion economy could actually be exceeded if you got more women into the workforce and they got their fair share and their fair stab at job opportunities. Likewise, the placement of members of the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe communities. Again, very poor representation in the higher echelons of the corporate sector, or indeed in any of the instruments of power and influence in this country, whether it's a judiciary, whether it is parliament, and so on. So I think there's lots that can be done to improve the ESG quotient. But if you flip this around and say, can I look at this as a glass half full? You could argue that we're making a lot of progress. There are new regulations. Recently, the Indian Ministry of Corporate Affairs brought out the National Guidelines on Responsible Business Conduct, which have now been integrated by the Securities and Exchange Board into what are called the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting requirements. And those apply to the top 1,000 listed companies in India from this financial year as a mandatory requirement. It will get extended to more companies, including companies in the private and unlisted space in the future. I think that's beginning to push the envelope in terms of better disclosure and real actions on the ground that companies are taking to really live up to their corporate responsibilities. So you could say that things are beginning to happen. You asked about best practices of companies in the ESG space, and across each of E, S, and G, you're seeing companies now take up the mantle and do something quite innovative, whether it's on issues like climate change, energy efficiency, and so on. So you could make the case that a lot more is now beginning to happen, and certainly awareness across the board, across all stakeholders, many of them empowered by new information, better science, social media networks, better technology that allows you to access information. All of that is helping the cause.
Very true. In fact, very beautifully summarized over there. Now, we saw something very interesting in COVID, that the government, the development sector, and the corporate sector worked together, whether it was awareness building, mask wearing, vaccination drive. So do you feel that the efforts of the development sector can be brought to bear in solving some of these problems? But the problem is that the issues are always of scale and scalability, and most are just too small. So can something you feel be done over here in this space?
So I'll just venture to make one suggestion which is applicable, I think, to the corporate sector, which is the sector I understand the best. Oftentimes the corporate sector, particularly the big corporates, will plead with the government for improving the ease of doing business. But if you look at the issues that the development sector faces, and indeed many of the startup community members face when dealing with the large corporates, you could argue that they have the same problem of ease of doing business, the large corporates. Many of the largest corporates in India are terrible bureaucracies to have to try and negotiate with, even to identify who is the stakeholder or the process owner for a particular application or processing of requirement for a loan or some sponsorship support or CSR funding can be a nightmare. You get tossed from one corridor to the next
table
corridor.
to the next.
Exactly. You don't get meetings, people don't return calls. So those are significant challenges. And therefore, I think that large corporates have a particular responsibility in India, given where they already sit, given a lot of the market domination that increasingly many of them exercise, to actually do more to support the development sector, to support the small and medium enterprises. They also control many of the value chains that operate across manufacturing, where there are tens of thousands of members. And I think on issues like climate change, there will be an expectation that they actually take the responsibility of, in a sense, reskilling, creating better awareness, in some cases, creating innovative tools for financing to support the transition that many of these smaller entities will need to make. So huge responsibility, I think, on the shoulders of the large corporates. And then, of course, government will have to play a role in legislating on some of these issues. So I think it'll have to be a combination of efforts to address the problem of scale that you talked about.
Synchronizing it all. Now, why is ESG important to investors? And there's an alternate thought that is just a relabeling of our age-old socio-environment related problems. So what is your view on that?
Well, at one level, I think it's absolutely right. We heard about the triple bottom line like 20 years back. And in many ways, ESG is nothing else, right? It's the same thing. People, planet, profits, prosperity, it's all sort of integrated. But I think what has changed is the sense of expectation that corporates will deliver more for all stakeholders. And I think the best evidence of that came from the United States, the bastion of free market capitalism in 2019, with the Business Roundtable, which has all the largest US Fortune 500 corporations as members, actually resolved that no longer would they subscribe to the theory that the role of the corporate is really to deliver value for one set of stakeholders, which is the shareholder primacy argument, which goes back to Milton Friedman. But indeed, they would have a responsibility to all their stakeholders for value creation. And I think that sort of is evidence that things have changed fundamentally across the world. And I think COVID in some ways has just made that sense of expectation even more pronounced. I think now with some of the global challenges you face, including climate change, I think there's an understanding that on many of these issues, if anyone has to make progress, everyone has to make progress. You can't have islands of prosperity or islands of health in the midst of a COVID pandemic. Rich and poor, everyone is equally affected. And that, I think, is the dawning. Absolutely.
That we felt we were all in it together.
Correct.
And it had nothing to do with geography, economic strata, nothing. Yeah.
Absolutely. But if you think back a few years, think about the Chennai floods, for instance, in 2015. For 7 days, that city was essentially underwater. And regardless of whether you were a rich business person or you were a poor person living in essentially some kind of ghetto, you had the same lack of access to food and water. You had the same likelihood of contracting disease. So many of these issues will not spare anyone. And you can't sort of opt out or build a wall around yourself and hope that the environment will not invade you. And I think that's making a big difference in people's outlook. And of course, COVID, I think, has had a particular influence. People have become much more conscious about the natural environment and the power that nature has to rebel against human influence if it is adverse. Yeah. So I think this is beginning to change a lot of our thinking. For millennials, you're seeing this quite in a very pronounced fashion. The way people are now thinking about work, what they expect from their work-life balance, the kind of expectation they have from employers, the sense of wanting to have purpose in life. I think all this is going to make a substantial difference in the way we navigate the future.
Agree with you 100%. I mean, in the last couple of decades, the tsunamis, the floodings in different parts of the world, and I think the millennials somehow are, I agree with you, have a much better sense of this and a much better understanding and respect for the environment compared to what it was 30, 40, 50 years ago when men took all the resources for granted. So moving on, COVID and consequent improvements in technology, of course, have been a big game changer in the last couple of years. So how has this impacted the ESG goals of companies?
I think in multiple dimensions. We just talked about some of the impact just in terms of the need to be more responsive to expectations of stakeholders. The fact that individuals who at the end of the day are customers for products and services the corporate sector produces are now much more aware and looking out for cues about this sort of sense of responsibility that corporates display. A year back, Unilever announced that all of their 70,000 plus consumer products around the world would start carrying labels that showed the carbon footprint required to get the product onto a customer's shelf. And I think that sort of is an indication of how serious-minded companies are beginning to respond to the expectation that customers have of corporate responsibility. And I think these companies will be ahead of the game because they are proactively responding to what they see as some of these concerns. Technology has obviously become a huge factor in the way in which companies are now responding. I think through COVID, people were able to actually test the proposition that you don't need to travel to get the job done, that meetings don't necessarily always have to be in person, that a lot of business can be transacted remotely. And I think that's had a beneficial impact on the carbon footprint.
On the environment.
That each one of us.
Carbon footprint.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So energy efficiency has improved. And there's an understanding that you can respond to crises in very innovative ways. And I think the whole digitalization phenomenon has received a huge fillip as a result of COVID. There have been obviously important sort of changes that corporates have started making in their supply chains. Some of this was because of the disruptions that COVID created. Some of it is obviously because of geopolitical developments. And there is now much more talk about nearshoring, which will again have beneficial impact on the environment. You're not going to be planning to move product through 3 continents and half the world just to reach your customers. You're trying to do it much more locally. So the local agenda, I think, is winning out partly as a result of that. So I think there's some very good sort of lessons
Positive
and
outcomes.
Consequences. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And technology, I think everyone understands now in the digital sphere. A lot of the talk in Web3 on blockchain, for instance, around assurance, and the whole ESG agenda. A lot of it, because it's so vast, there's a lot of concerns around things like greenwashing, right? Corporates can say any number of things and possibly get away with it without actually delivering the best outcomes, simply because it's such a vast space, maybe not everyone is tracking it closely. But with some of the new tools that you have, including blockchain, I think the ability to authenticate, to capture information and data, and to hold corporates to their promise has dramatically improved in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think that's going to be very consequential in the way in which companies are being held to their test of corporate responsibility.
True. And on one side, you have the customer, the other side, you have the shareholder. And, so they have to deliver. I'm just going to change tracks a bit. And ESG talent is in short supply in our country, with most individuals either coming from the EHS or the CSR background. So how do we rapidly increase the number of professionals with deep specialization or expertise in this area?
I think it's beginning to happen already in that many of the universities, management schools are beginning to at least bring in modules or courses on sustainability and on ESG investing and the like. There are specialized modules that entities like the CFA Society have introduced. I'm part of an expert committee created by the Indian Institute of Corporate Affairs, which is affiliated with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs. They're coming out with, I think, a 70-hour module on ESG. So I think a lot of the inputs that members of management and teams across the corporate world will need are becoming available very quickly. Personally, though, I do believe that the most effective sustainability interventions will happen from many of the general managers who've seen multiple facets of business and understand the value of now incorporating sustainability and ESG considerations into strategy. In fact, I see no reason why somebody who's passionate about ESG and sustainability cannot aspire to actually lead corporations in the future, particularly given the kind of emphasis that all the different stakeholders have on achieving better standards of ESG performance. So I would love to see not just specialists, quote unquote, who are being trained on ESG sustainability, but indeed mid-career professionals from HR, from finance, from strategy, business development, marketing, manufacturing, who choose to familiarize themselves with some of the basic concepts and then become sustainability
innovative,
leads. Absolutely.
creative, and take it forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That's interesting. So trainings and upskilling on this will really help. So
Absolutely.
my final question to you is, what is your advice to the rising stars in this function on how they should manage their careers going forward? We have a lot of young people in the audience and they would love to hear your views on this.
So I think actually linked to the previous point about training and courses, I think, you should obviously have a sense of whether you want to be a specialist, for instance, in the E, S, potentially even the G domains, and then sort of become somebody who's really strong in that domain, build your knowledge. Climate change, for instance, is going to be a particularly important E issue, not just for India, but for the rest of the world. And therefore, your understanding of what are the key drivers of greenhouse gas production, what are the new technologies, what are the ways in which you address this problem, that will be a skill set that's going to be in great demand. But, I would hope that many young people would also want to make a career across business, impacting the future of their organizations. And the best way to do that is lead the organization, aspire to be the CEO, chairman of the board. And I think there are going to be a requirement for skill sets that can, address the broader ESG performance of any organization. If you approach it with a very narrow sense of what you want to do, you may not be able to deliver what the organization expects. So try and get the experience of all that goes on in a business. So try and spend some time in different functions, so you see it from the other person's point of view. It's easy to say that okay, this is important. Let's say energy efficiency is important. Let's make the investment tomorrow. Change all our processes. But then you start talking to the finance team, and if you did a stint of 6 months in the CFO's office and see the kind of struggle they have in raising capital and then investing it properly, getting the right outcomes that investors are looking for, you suddenly realize that spending money is not that simple. So I think it's very important to be able to wear multiple hats in an organization before you become truly capable of offering direction and guidance on how to mainstream sustainability in the business strategy. So I would hope that there would be many young people who would choose to make a career broadly across these functions, with maybe a larger focus on ESG and sustainability, with a view to eventually, spearheading their organization's ESG program and strategy. But for that, as I said, you need to have spent some time in some of these other roles. Very often now, people are leaning, to the closest approximation they think they can get to ESG experts in their organization. So they'll call upon the support of the CSR lead, if there is one, for instance. But I think that defeats the purpose. You need people who've seen business from multiple dimensions and angles, and then can deliver very sensible outcomes. Factoring in this is one more very important consideration.
Superb. So yes, young people can learn the basic concepts, and of course, clearly it's a top-down, so we need senior professionals to lead this initiative. We have a couple of interesting questions. Adya from Third Sector Partners wants to ask you a question. So could you please have the spotlight on Adya?
Thank you so much, Dr. Mukund. It's been a pleasure to hear all about ESG, and my question is relating to the one we were just discussing. We've as you know, and on this earth, basically, we've had a long time of industrialization, many years of industrialization. How can we now going forward that we know that it has sort of in a way really affected the earth, generally the environment and everything on the earth, humans, animals, everything. How can we cover the gap between industrialization and sustainability, considering we're going and moving towards sustainability? And how much time do we really need, or do you think we have before things get worse to do that really?
So that's the trillions of dollar question, if I might say, because the impact that a profound understanding of that question and the solutions would have on the global economy is, I think, of that order of magnitude at a minimum, because it really will lead to a profound restructuring of the way we think about the role of business in the society and what is expected from corporate leaders. So when you ask about time, if you talk to climate specialists, they'll say it's really this decade. Right. If we don't fix the issue of carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon budget that we have is going to get busted so badly that retrieving the situation without the risk of a number of extreme climatic events is going to be essentially impossible. So you could argue this is the make or break decade. Now, in many of these issues, I think we have a pretty good sense of what needs to be done. The technology, for the most part, is available or almost there. What you're missing is a combination of financial support and top leadership, which is bold, courageous, and wants to do the right thing. We're beginning to now see citizens express their ire when political parties are not showing that leadership. In the European Union, for instance, now the Greens are effectively charting a lot of their strategy going forward, except for the recent mishap that has happened thanks to the Russia-Ukraine war. I think there was a pretty strong agenda, green agenda that is being prosecuted. I would expect to see more of that, more involvement of young people in our party political process, because without that, you're going to have business and life as usual. And in countries like India, where the developmental agenda is still sort of catching up with the kind of standards that people experience in terms of quality of life in other markets, I think it's going to require particular boldness and courage in the party political system to emphasize some of these sustainability considerations. Occasionally, when there is a potential conflict with the developmental agenda. So I think the need of the hour is really bold and visionary leadership. Financing could be a challenge, but if you have the right perspective on what you want to achieve, I think we have some of the smartest business people in this country. And the fact that they go abroad and they become chairman of corporations like Google and Microsoft says something, right? Yeah. I think financing or ways to get around financial constraints can be found, and the technology exists. But you need that combination of forward-looking, spirited corporate leadership, holding hands with a much more evolved political leadership than anything we've seen so far. Absent that, I think we will run out of time.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Our next question is from Shubha Lakshmi. So could we have the spotlight on her, please?
Good evening, Mr. Rajan. So I have a question for you. What are the challenges that are faced by the Indian entrepreneurs who choose ESG as a framework?
So I guess it depends on the sector they are in, because ESG challenges will vary from sector to sector. If, like many young entrepreneurs, people are doing something in the IT world, for instance, the E aspect may not be a particularly important issue, but you could have many S-related challenges, for instance. Across the board, I suspect the G issue is turning out to be quite an important area of focus that many startups need to sort of spend time on. But the question I often get asked is, ESG does involve investment of time, sometimes more resources and financing. And in the early stage of an organization's journey as an entrepreneur, should people be spending that time? And the answer I always give is, look, there's no time like the present. If you try and delay things, if you defer what you know could be important considerations for your future sustainability, the risk is then you create processes, frameworks, and attitudes within your organization that make reversing the trend later very, very difficult. A case in point is, for instance, the ethics agenda. You'll have startups that say, look, I'm too small, I'm not a Tata that I can, not offer a bribe or, secure my permits simply because I'm so large and the local government needs me as an employer. I'm a startup and I have to pay this guy money to get my work done or to get my approval. The point I make is you might do it once, you might do it twice, but if you then start creating a sense in your organization amongst your colleagues that, look, anything goes, we need to get ahead, whatever needs to be done, just do it, pay money, pay the bribe, and move on. With what face 3 years down the line, when maybe you're 5 times the size you are today, with what face are you going to tell people that now the rules have changed, please no longer be corrupt, let us no longer do the wrong thing? It's difficult, right? People will say, but we saw you do it, we saw you carry suitcases of cash, now why are you trying to preach to us? So it sets in motion, I think, phenomena that become very difficult to reverse later on. So all of these issues, I think you need to have a calibrated approach. Take your time for sure. I mean, a good example I give is climate change. The best organization in the world, I just talked about Unilever a few minutes back, they have declared that their net zero target year is 2039. It is 17 years from today. So while they understand that climate change is a critical and urgent issue, they're not promising action by next year. They're going to take 17 years to deliver. But what they will have is a roadmap and a plan. Every year they'll do a little bit more. So startups also, nobody's saying you have to change the world tomorrow, but don't put in place processes that tomorrow you're going to regret. So have a calibrated approach, decide what is doable in the immediate short term, take on targets that are feasible, that are within the constraints of your financing, your resources, and try and do the right thing to the best extent possible.
Thank you so much.
Wonderfully summed
Thank
up.
you so much.
And we have run out of time, but not out of questions. So thank you so much, Mukund. Wonderful hearing your views. Always very inspiring, very motivating. And a big thank you to our listeners for logging in. And we'll be back in a few weeks with the next episode. And a big thank you to you, Dr. Rajan, for wonderful views. And yes, I have read his book Outlast as well. And I highly recommend that the first step to building up your knowledge on this subject is to read the book, beautifully explained with wonderful examples. So on that note, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.